Hi, everyone. It's Mike Spivey. It is Thursday, May 13th. I am honored to have with me Dr. Gabor Maté, retired physician who practiced not just family care and palliative care, but spent a good deal of his career helping some of the most addicted people on the planet. We're going to talk today about anxiety and maybe some of the antidotes for test day anxiety and the causes. We're also going to talk a little bit about addiction. Notice I didn't say substance abuse. I said addiction. You can be addicted to status checking, for example. I think some of our listeners can relate. You can be addicted to workaholism, and probably society will reward you. So that'll be the second half of the interview. Dr. Maté has written not one, not two, not three, but 4 best-selling books. I've read one of them just recently, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. He has life experience beyond which I will ever have, and it's because of that experience we are so honored to have him with us today. So without further delay, Dr. Gabor Maté.
First, Dr. Maté, I sincerely want to thank you for the thousands of patients you've treated and seen. And I just finished In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. I feel like it should be required reading for humanity and the human condition. So thank you for writing it.
What a great accolade. Thank you.
Can we start with you for a second?
Sure. My favorite topic. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's becoming a topic I know well. You're in your 40s. The external world looks at you and they say, here's this driven, hardworking, successful doctor. This person has it all. And you're not saying the same thing inside your head. Is that right?
No, I was very frustrated. I had a deep sense of unfulfilled potential. I was depressed. I had anxiety, tension, stresses, even conflict in my marriage. I sensed my kids were afraid of me. I wasn't a happy man.
What was the turning point for you to make you look, I believe, inward and notice all that?
Well, just the sheer misery of being in my skin, and wanted to see, is it possible to experience life differently? And what I've always been interested in is the question why. I'm far more interested in the why than I'm in the how. And so wanting to understand things has been a character feature of mine, I think, since childhood. And so I wanted to find out why. And at some point, when you stop blaming the world for causing you to feel the way you're feeling right now, you have to say, well, what's inside of me that's generating all this suffering?
What's interesting to me is I did the same thing in my 40s. In fact, after listening to you and a few others, I stopped blaming myself too. I stopped blaming the world, but I also stopped blaming a younger version of me. And it was an incredibly helpful intervention. But I suspect the 22-year-old version of me would be incapable of doing that. And I'm curious to your observation. Most of our listeners are probably 20 to 30. What would be a way to get rid of any skepticism about looking inward? Because it has been so successful for many of your listeners, your readers, your patients. How would you speak to the 20-year-old version of you?
Well, when I was 20, in my 20s, I had a very wise, very troubled, very traumatized, but very wise aunt who was a physician. And she sent me this line from Polonius, from Shakespeare's Hamlet, which said, above all, to thy own self be true. Problem is, I had no idea what she was talking about. So I don't know what my own 20-year-old self would have understood. However, Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And there's a lot of truth in that not from a perspective of self-blame, but really from a perspective of self-understanding. There's a tension between what the world does and then how we react to it. So young people, naturally enough, are focused on the world outside and how to understand it and how to do something about it or with it, how to fit into it, how to change it, how to protect yourself from it. And those are important questions. And I think what needs to happen is those questions, without being dismissed, need to be coupled by a self-inquiry, which is what makes me feel the way I feel, what influences shape my existence, how I feel about the world, how I feel about myself. What can I do about getting to know myself? Until you know yourself, you're kind of crippled. And in this society, it's so externally focused from early childhood onwards that we keep putting our attention on the outside and on the outside and on the outside. And we don't learn the skill or even the importance of looking inward. So if I could speak to my 20-year-old self, I'd say, listen, I totally get how you're feeling and what you're interested in, but buddy, do look at yourself at the same time. Investigate both the outside and the inside with equal curiosity. That's what I would say. And I would also say to people, if you're feeling anxious, you're not crazy, there's good reason for it. If you're feeling depressed, you're not crazy, there's good reason for it. And the more you can find out the reason, the more powerful you'll be in regulating your response to life.
You mentioned feeling anxious, which is a very important topic for our listeners. I'm curious the difference between anxiety and stress.
Well, let's make a distinction first between anxiety and fear. So, for example, there's a legitimate fear of, say, catching COVID, or there's a legitimate fear around climate change. It's happening and it's threatening human existence. Those legitimate fears, that's not the same as anxiety. Anxiety is the state in which my mind is hypervigilant and I focus on all the fearful things, but in a very powerless kind of way. And anxiety is an internally generated state. Fear, healthy fear, is a response to something on the outside. Anxiety is a response to something on the inside. And that anxiety is not to be talked out of, but to be understood. And I'm telling you, its sources are always in one's formative years, in early childhood, whether people recognize it or not. So that's anxiety. Now, anxiety and fear and stress, well, the one sets off the other. The body's stress response mechanism is designed to ward off threats. And whether the threat is real or imagined or self-generated, my body's going to have a stress response. So the anxiety state is a stress state in which if I measured your blood hormone levels and your nervous system activity, it would not be at baseline. So anxiety is a major trigger for stress. And then the more stressed you are, the more anxiety you're going to have as well. So there's a feedback loop between anxiety and stress.
I've always thought I'll give you a story of sort of from my world. Our firm on a daily basis talks to tens, if not hundreds of people aged 18 to 30, college applicants, graduate school applicants. They're taking practice standardized tests and they're doing well. The first time they take the test for real, when it counts on game day, the test questions don't get any more difficult. They're not changing, but the scores are generally lower than the highest practice tests. The only variable that's changing is the pressure of the test counting. And I've always thought of that as the higher the stakes, the more anxiety people feel. Am I wrong though?
No, you're not necessarily accurate. That may be true in practice, but it doesn't need to be. I mean, the higher the stakes, depending on what inner resources I wield, I may be more grounded and more calm and more present and more equipped to deal with the higher stakes. So what you're describing has been called evaluative stress. And this has been studied in a laboratory. You put people, you give them a simple task, doing which they seem to be evaluated. Now, these are paid volunteers. Nothing is at stake for them. When they leave the lab, nothing in their life is going to change. But those that are subjected to evaluative stress, when they leave the lab, their stress hormones are still elevated hours later. So that's called evaluative stress. Now, the problem is that we live in a society that puts people under evaluative stress from the moment they're born, because very few children experience unconditional, loving acceptance for exactly who they are. So much of the time, our sense of acceptance depends on how well we impress others, including our parents. Are we a nice kid? Are we a good kid? Are we a good-looking kid? Are we a smart kid? Are we a skillful kid? Are we good at sports? Do I say the right things? Did I express the right emotions at the right time? All this is being evaluated, and the child is getting that sense of evaluation, the absence of unconditional acceptance. And then we live in a society that's highly competitive. This is a competitive society. It's built on competition, which means it's built on fear of losing. So then you put people into the situation of these exams, add a high degree of evaluative stress. And when people are under stress, their brains don't function as well, precisely because the lower parts of the brain gets overactivated. The higher parts of the brain, which are the cognitive and rational parts of the brain that can form a proper evaluation of present situation and respond appropriately, those are kind of disabled because of the overactivity of the fear centers, the lower centers. In this society, it's a common phenomenon. It doesn't need to be, but it's how we bring up kids. It's how we put them through school. And then you enter a profession like say medicine or law, same thing. And then people like totally identify in this society with their role in life. If, when I was applying for medical school, I don't know what I would have done if I had been rejected. Even now, I don't want to imagine. I so much identified with that particular role. So no wonder people are anxious. And no wonder they don't do as well on the real test than on the practice test.
So I believe you're talking about the attribute-based esteem. And it sounds like maybe the intervention, the antidote, well, you tell me, would be to detach it to the extent you can from attribute-based esteem and go to a more unconditional-based esteem. Do I have that right?
Well, absolutely true. I'm just writing a new book. In this chapter that I'm currently working on, I lay out what are generally being identified as basic human needs. One of them is a sense of being related and connected with. So the more isolated we are, the more anxious we are. Autonomy, genuine self-esteem is one of them. And genuine self-esteem is a self-esteem that doesn't say, I'm worthwhile because I can do this, that, or the other. It doesn't say I'm worthwhile because everybody thinks I'm great. I'm worthwhile whether or not I can do this, that, or the other. I'm worthwhile whether or not anybody thinks I'm great. But that genuine self-esteem is rooted in early childhood experience. And very few people grow up with that genuine self-esteem. And a lot of us, as maybe you found and I found, we got all the external validation. And even now, I'm 77 now, and I've written best-selling books, published 28 or 30 languages, and I get all these accolades. But on a given day, I can still feel lousy about myself. In fact, the less I care about all that stuff, the more calm I am. But I'm saying that for young people brought up in that way, it's extraordinarily challenging.
I'm going to plug your book again because I do think it's extraordinarily helpful, at least the one I read, which is in the realm of Hungry Ghosts. Your new book, what's its name and when does it come out? Because I'm going to devour it.
The new book is entitled The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. And precisely the point I'm making is that what's normal in this society is actually abnormal when it comes to meeting genuine human needs. There's a great social psychologist, Eric Fromm, who wrote in 1955 that mental health cannot be defined as an individual fitting into society, but as a society meeting the genuine needs of human beings. This society, particularly in its present incarnation, fails. And so if you look at the statistics, depression is rising, anxiety is rising, all manner of disorders are rising in numbers, more and more people are being medicated, more and more young people are visiting emergency rooms because of suicidal ideation, the rise in addictive behaviors. But what is that a sign of? It means it's a sign not of individual pathology, but of a society that just doesn't know how to meet human needs. Not only doesn't know how to meet them, it actually crushes them for the sake of its own perpetuation.
Yeah, our genes don't change in 100 years, but society certainly does.
Yeah, no, our genes don't change in 100 years. And so when all these things are rising, and this whole idea, even the whole idea of mental health conditions being genetic is actually scientific nonsense. I mean, I could expiate at length about that, but except to say that genes are turned on and off by the environment. So you can have certain pro-inflammatory genes, but that doesn't mean you're going to get inflammation. But if something happens in the environment that triggers those genes, then you're going to get inflammation. You also have anti-inflammatory genes, which, when properly triggered, will control inflammation in your body. But when they're silenced, then inflammation takes over.
Right.
So much depends on what happens to people. And epigenetics really means on top of genes. So how does the environment regulate genetic activity? And genetic structure itself does not determine if somebody's going to be anxious or not, depressed or not, psychotic or not, addicted or not. Any such belief, although a lot of people embrace it, they just don't know how to look at the evidence, or they haven't seen the evidence to tell you the truth.
Are parents more detached because of the immediacy of society? Is that some of the reason for the increase in depression, suicide, anxiety, addiction?
Yeah, you don't see these conditions in Aboriginal groups, hardly. When you actually look at how human beings evolved, and this has been studied very carefully, when you look at how human beings evolved, we didn't evolve in civilization. Civilization has been around 10, 12,000 years, what we call civilization. Before then, and for many people until even recently, human beings evolved in, for hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years actually, we evolved in small band hunter-gatherer groups out there in nature. That was our evolutionary niche. Now, human beings are more adaptable than any other animal. We can live in a broader range of environments. A polar bear wouldn't survive in Africa, and a crocodile wouldn't survive on the North Pole. But human beings can survive in both environments. So we're very infinitely adaptable. But that doesn't mean that we do best when we lose the circumstances for which we were evolved. Now, if you think of your lungs evolved in response to oxygen. If there wasn't oxygen in the Earth environment, we wouldn't have human beings. So we're an expectation. We don't have an expectation for oxygen. We are an expectation for oxygen. In the same way, human beings are an expectation for certain kind of parenting, certain kind of holding, certain kind of community. We're an expectation for that. We're way beyond our evolutionary niche. In fact, we live in a society that in many ways denies our basic needs, as I said earlier. No wonder there's so many problems. And then what modern medicine does, in its mindless separation of mind and body, in which I was trained, of course, is we reduce everything to individual pathology. But take something like depression. Just take something like depression. Mike, what does it mean to depress something?
The de-elevated state?
Well, how about saying it in English language? What does it mean to depress something?
Bring it down.
You're pushing it down, yeah?
Yeah.
Well, what gets pushed down in depression is emotions. But why would a person push down their emotions? Only because when they were children, their emotions were not welcomed. And in order to connect with the nurturing environment, they had to push down their emotions. That's how they learned to survive. So to say that depression is the pathology of an individual is to ignore the fact that they learned how to do that in the context of a system, a family system, and a broader culture. How many times have people told, don't be so sensitive? In other words, don't feel so much. Or cheer up, it can't be that bad. In other words, don't feel your sadness, don't feel your anger. We can't handle it. So then, is depression a problem of the individual, or was it created in a relationship with a family or a society? And so I could go down the whole list of so-called mental illnesses and show that really they're adaptations to a certain environment. And to look for the source of the pathology in an isolated individual, and particularly in the biology of the brain of a particular individual, is to ignore the fact that we're social creatures, and that sociality includes our biology, and our brains themselves are formed in interaction with other people, and their biological mechanisms are shaped by the quality of our relationships. And I'm not making this up. This is pure brain science. We've only known this for about 4 decades, or at least 3 decades, I would say, published in major journals and books and so on. It's just that the average physician is not taught this material. So we're still individualizing pathology.
I feel like I don't have a psychology degree. I have a philosophy degree, and I think of you as a philosopher. I heard Alanis Morissette interview you, and she called you a philosopher. I like that.
Well, philosophy, if you look back on it, it included a lot of what later became scientific inquiry or psychological inquiry. Like Aristotle was a philosopher, but they did not deal with nature and science. So it's not just a stretch. And actually, Galen, who was a Roman physician in the early decades, in the early centuries, I forget, 3rd century, he said that a physician must also be a philosopher. That actually is the epigraph to my new book.
I believe it was Heraclitus who said we give drugs we know little about, medicine we know little about, to treat diseases we know less about, to cure the human condition we know hardly anything about. This quote always stuck with me.
Well, it's still true.
So I do think the field of psychology is drifting more in the direction that you've been espousing for many, many years. Is that accurate, that we need to take a look at our childhood? And even if it's as simple as our parents left us alone for 6 hours, that is trauma. Maybe not an uppercase T, but a lowercase t.
Well, now, if you look at it from the point of view of human expectation, in Aboriginal societies, in hunter-gatherer societies, they never leave kids alone. They carry them everywhere they go. You know, the papoose in North America. And kids are not allowed to cry. When I say not allowed to cry, it's not that they're forbidden to cry, it's that they're picked up as soon as they whimper. Because that regulates their brains and it reduces their stress hormones, which promotes healthy brain development. So parents who are told today to let their kids cry it out and cry themselves to sleep and leave the kid alone, it completely runs against human nature. And it does interfere with our healthy development. Now, is the field moving that way? Well, look, the number 3 best-selling books in the New York Times last week was The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, who's a trauma psychiatrist. That's astonishing. It's 17 this morning on Amazon. My books, they haven't been as mega sellers as that, but they've done very well. There's a new book by Bruce Perry, who's a child psychiatrist and researcher, and Oprah. It's called What Happened to You, which is about looking at childhood trauma. So this conversation is getting more and more acceptance and more relevance for those that are interested. Next month, you can check this out online. There's a new documentary coming out about my work called The Wisdom of Trauma. You can just Google that and you can watch it. So the conversation is spreading and taking more root. On the other hand, the dominant modalities in psychiatry are still behavioral ones, where they try and change people's behaviors and people's thoughts rather than looking at the emotional basis of those behaviors and thoughts. Runs contrary to human development, because guess what develops first? The emotional circuits.
Yeah.
And then, so to approach things from a point of view of behavior or cognition is to ignore the fact that all that is based on a scaffolding of emotions. And emotions are programmed in us beginning in the womb. So the emotional states of your mom already had a huge impact on how you developed.
If you're 23 years old and you've already experienced these traumas from childhood that you had understandably zero skills as a 3-year-old, 2-year-old to do with them, so you put them into your subconscious, and you're about to start law school, we'll say, and you're nervous, you're about to be part of a new pack that can reject and ostracize you. What is the antidote? Someone who's 23 and very nervous about to be thrown into this hostile, cruel, at times environment. What can they do?
Listen, first of all, really decide that that's what you want to do, because you're going into a profession that's going to be highly stressful, highly competitive, and very tough on its members. The last thing I can say about the legal system is that it contains even an ounce of compassion, either for its practitioners, let alone for the people that stand in front of it for judgment. I'm talking about not the individuals, but the system. I could go on at length about that. If you join a firm, everybody's going to look at you, your billable hours, and how does that compare to your competitors and your colleagues and all this kind of stuff. Lawyers are a stressed population. So make sure you're cut out for it. Make sure that's what you really want to do. And ask yourself, why do I want to do it? If you're really turned on by the idea of justice and you want to serve justice, I'll say, well, you might get some disillusionment along the way, but at the same time, fair enough. You're going to go into the system and you're going to do what you can do. If you're also very clear that you want the status and the money, I'm not going to argue with you, but then realize the price you're going to pay and ask yourself, is it worth it to me? Or are you trying to do it because you want to please your parents? Right. That's the worst reason to go into it. And a lot of people do, by the way. They all joke about what is the Jewish definition. As a Jew, I can say this. What is the Jewish definition of when life begins? You know the answer? When the eldest son is accepted into medical school. And for a lot of groups, the same thing is true for law school. So make sure that whatever motivation you have is coming from within yourself, not trying to impress or please others. Then know that the anxiety that you're feeling doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It's a response to life. You can get help with it. Don't try and grin and bear it. Don't try and push it down. Go and talk to somebody. Get help with it. Be curious about it. Don't imagine there's something wrong with you. You're going to look at all your confident classmates and you're going to go in there, with all manner of self-doubt. You're making the big mistake of comparing their outsides with your inside. You have no idea what their inside is like. And believe me, you're not the only one. Unfortunately, if law school is like medical school, which I'm sure it is, there's no mechanisms built into your education to deal with these stresses. There should be. It should be part of your education. So that means you need to find the support for yourself. Go see a counselor, get a therapist. If you want a cheap resource, and by cheap, I don't mean to devalue it, a non-expensive or in fact free resource, check out all my talks on YouTube. They're going to help you. It doesn't cost you any money. I'm not looking for anything except that they've been seen by hundreds of thousands of people, and a lot of people tell me it's maybe helpful to them. Or other talks. People talk about trauma, Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk, any number of people. Check out these resources. Get support, intellectual support, getting support, reach out for help, or 30 minutes of yoga or physical exercise. Sleep. Don't deprive yourself of sleep. You're stressing a system. It's not worth it. What kind of food are you putting into your body? Are you shoveling down junk food to get through so that you can get back to your books? You're selling yourself short if you do that. So there's all these things. But above all, be curious about it. Don't make yourself wrong for it. Oh, I'm feeling this. I wonder what that's about.
Yeah.
That's what I call compassionate curiosity or compassionate inquiry.
So you mentioned how stressful the legal community can be. I believe is of all the professions, it's Anna, my wonderful COO, who you've spoken to, found where it was listed as the fourth highest percentage of substance abuse. And I heard you in the realm, I say heard because I listened to it on Audible. I heard in the realm of Hunger Grows, you mentioned that there's a relationship between sort of three things have to happen for addiction, but stress is one of those three.
Yeah. So let me give you a definition of addiction, okay? Your listeners can gauge for themselves to what degree this might apply to them. An addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary relief or pleasure in, and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences as a result of, and cannot give up despite the negative consequences. So pleasure, relief, craving in the short term, harm in the long term, whether it's physical harm, emotional harm, relational harm, spiritual harm, and then the inability to give it up. So, Mike, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm not going to ask you for any details, but notice that in my definition, I didn't say anything about drugs. And what I mean to say by that is that addiction can be to drugs, and heavily addicted population in Vancouver's downtown east side that I worked with were addicted to all manner of drugs. But I've been addicted myself to behaviors, putting to work and shopping and so on. So according to that definition, then, addiction can be to gambling, to sex, to the internet, to work, to extreme sports, to pornography, to self-cutting, to eating, to shopping, to a virtually endless range of human activities, and to drugs. And so my question then is, if you're open to answering it, without identifying anything, in your life, have you ever had an addictive pattern that would fit that definition?
I'd actually like to identify it because I'd like to hear your take on it.
Okay.
So when I was in high school, I would set my alarm for 1 a.m. and I would sneak out of my house because my parents didn't want me up at 1 a.m. I would go to the track and I would run often until I got physically sick. So I would be lying on the ground throwing up. It felt anesthetic in the moment because I felt like no one else on the planet was doing it. So there must be something right with me. I'm certain didn't produce long-term benefits, but probably had long-term negative. It's not a habit you want to get into long-term. And at some point I realized, you know what, Mike, maybe there's something wrong with me that I'm doing this. I went to a train platform at 2 a.m. and tried to do 1,000 push-ups.
Okay. So you already told me what it did for you. That was going to be our next question. What you said it anesthetized you. Now, when do people need to be anesthetized?
Yeah, and they need to escape something, some pain.
Yeah. So that you had pain there. So is pain relief a legitimate goal or not?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, exactly. We all want pain relief. In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. The pain was your problem. And your addiction was a particular response to your pain, very particular to you, but it worked for you temporarily. Right. And all addictions are a response to pain, in my view. And that's why my mantra on addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And so what I'm saying about addiction is that the question is not what's wrong with you. The question is what happened to you. In other words, why did you have the pain? And we don't have to go into that discussion, but I can tell you that I've done this conversation thousands of times. And usually it takes me Even if a person doesn't realize what pain they had, it takes me 3 minutes to help them identify it. So what I'm saying is that addiction is always a response to trauma, and that pain, that wound that you sustained, that hurt, that's the trauma. And then there has to be some available behavior or drug, and then usually some stress that makes you want to reach for that soothing. So, for example, when people are engaged in some addictive behavior, whether it's to drugs or sex or whatever it is, and they give it up, and then they relapse. When you ask what happened, how come they relapsed? Usually they were stressed. And when they were growing up, they didn't develop the capacity to regulate stress and to handle stress, except through external means. Now, that's not for their fault. It's just what happened to them. This is a very stressed society, and the whole economy is based on selling people stuff to regulate their stress, stuff they don't actually need. But since they have no way of dealing with their stress, they rely on these products. And there's nothing more pernicious than a cell phone for that effect. People are regulating their stresses through their cell phones. And so there's a legitimate use for the cell phone, which is communication. But how often are people actually using it not to communicate anything meaningful, but to escape from the stress that they're feeling?
I think if I were to identify one common feature of our listeners, it's that they likely would tell you they check their email, they check message boards, social media, and what's called status checkers, which is the name of our podcast, Status Check with Spivey. They check it, habitually, obsessively, consistently. And I think, it probably meets your definition. I'm sure it's temporarily numbing, pleasurable to see if that law school admitted you, but doing it 50 to 100, one person did it 1,600 times in one day. He checked his status checker alone for Georgetown Law School. That's an addiction.
It certainly is a compulsion. And you say, what's behind it? Well, what's behind it is, unless they like me, I'm not worth anything. So behind that compulsion, there's a unconscious belief about the self, which is a trauma imprint. So ask yourself this question. Those of you that check your emails, and by the way, I'm not free from that habit either, but when we check our emails, or if I check who says what about me on the internet, I'm looking for, what if I believe that I'm completely worthwhile, and what other people think of me might be interesting, but it doesn't matter to my sense of self? Then I wouldn't be checking anything. Why would I waste my time? Thomas Merton, Catholic monk, he died young, and he wrote his autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, when he was quite young. And he talked about this weird way of being where we only exist in the minds of other people. That's what we do. I mean, and that was before the days of internet. So when you check on Facebook how many people like you, right, and how many friends you have, you're existing in the minds of other people, not in your own body, not in your own soul. And we live in a society that encourages that. And the younger generations are very much caught in that dynamic.
Whether it's drugs, alcohol, internet, gambling, shopping, you name it. There's a quote that you quoted in your book, In the Realm, that I will never forget this quote. I believe I have it word for word. It's hard to get enough of something that almost works.
Right. That was uttered by Dr. Vincent Felitti, who's an internal medicine specialist in San Diego, who's the lead author of what's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. This is the research done on a massive scale, repeated since, validated over and over again, that showed that the more adversity, or if you like, the more trauma a child experiences, the greater risk of mental health problems, the greater risk of addiction, the greater the risk of physiological disease, autoimmune disease, malignancy, and so on. And Vince said that it's hard to get enough of something that almost works because, like in your case, that running, it almost worked. It temporarily took you out of your pain. But of course, since it doesn't resolve the fundamental problem, you have to keep going back to it and back to it. So it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. When I check the status of my best-selling status of my book, and oh boy, it's up 1,000 points. Yeah. Oh, great! I'm feeling good. But it doesn't resolve my own self-doubt about myself. So it almost works, but then I have to keep going back and going back to get that hit over and over again, which, by the way, is the definition of an addiction.
And even as much work you've put into yourself, even with the thousands of people you've treated, tens of thousands, I think this is good for the listeners to hear. You still find yourself from time to time saying, oh, let me check on what they're saying about me online. Let me see if my book's number 12 or 20. And if it's 12, not 20, you get a dopamine hit.
Yeah. Or if it's 2,000 and not 5,000, you know.
I think it should be 12 in my mind.
In my humble opinion, yes, too, but that's okay. I'm not complaining. Hungry Ghost was a number one bestseller in Canada, by the way, for a while. So, yeah, well, this is ongoing work. The fact is, I sort of smile at it now. I don't identify with it. I don't get all caught up in it. I don't get upset about it. And if it gives me pleasure, it's a pretty mild one at this point. So I'm far from in its grips anymore. But you know what? There's still a part of me that wants to go there sometimes. And that's okay. You know, I'll say, well, okay, little kid, yeah, you didn't get the attention you needed, did you, when you were small?
Yeah.
Still, part of you is still looking for that attention, isn't it? Okay, little fellow, we'll take care of you. You know, so the thing is to be gentle with that part of yourself.
I've heard you call addiction the dumb friend, and I guess maybe you call childhood traumas the little fellow.
Yeah, all our adaptive mechanisms are what I call them the stupid friends. And that, like that depression where a kid pushes down their feelings, that was a friend because you needed to do that. Like, for example, there's a very famous Canadian psychologist that I hesitate to honor with the name psychologist because I don't think he understands very much, but he's very famous and very successful. And he says that an angry little kid should be made to sit by themselves until he comes back to normal. He says this in his mega-selling book. I'm quoting him verbatim. And even that it's okay to hit a kid. Hunter-gatherer people didn't hit their kids, by the way, for good reason. So he says that, okay? All right. So kid gets angry and he gets the message, I'm going to be excluded. I'm going to be made to sit by myself. I'm going to be separated from, which is my biggest fear, of separation from my parents. So therefore, if I want to be with my parents, I have to push down my anger. So that depression, that pushing down, it's a friend because it helps you maintain those connections. But it's a stupid friend because it doesn't realize that you're no longer that 2-year-old. Now you're in your 20s and 30s, and that pushing down emotions is actually getting in your way. And that's why I call it the stupid friend.
So I'm very mindful of your time. I know how busy your schedule is. Maybe a good note to end on is what I've done per things you have said, per things a psychologist named Terry Real.
Yeah, I know that. I've talked with Terry.
I heard him say something similar, which is, write a letter to yourself, or you can do it in your mind, but writing we had Dr. Guy Winch on our podcast, and Dr. Winch mentioned that writing hits more areas of your brain than just thinking about it.
By the way, especially if you write it by hand.
Interesting. I have dysgraphia, I maintain, so I might not be able to read my own writing, but I'll try that. Write a letter to yourself saying, thanking that younger version of yourself for those maladaptive behaviors, for the running at 1 a.m. Maybe I needed it. I needed to get away. I needed to detach.
There's no maybe. And they were not maladaptive. They were adaptive. They're maladaptive now. It's sort of like this. It gets pretty cold in the winter in Boulder, doesn't it?
Very much so.
You adapt to it. You put on warm clothing. It saves your life. What would happen to you if you wore the same clothing in the summertime?
Yeah, that would be maladaptive because I'm still doing it.
Yeah, that's the problem, is that these patterns that we take on as children, now the clothing is no problem because you did it deliberately and consciously. So you can take it off at will.
Right.
Patterns that are programmed into us early in childhood, they were adaptive at the time, but we didn't do them consciously or deliberately. Our nature, our organism did it automatically to protect us. So therefore we take them for our reality. And we carry them with us. And now it's summertime, it's time to take them off. And we're not quite aware of that. And this is why we keep getting into trouble. Yeah. Well, so the thing is to learn how to let go of those patterns without resenting them or resenting ourselves. Okay, yeah, they had a reason to come along, but they don't serve me anymore.
So I highly, highly suspect all the work you do now has nothing to do with accolades, nothing to do with things that matter to you in your 40s. You're trying to make the world a better place. And I very much thank you for it, for all you've done. I'm going to read your next book. I hope our listeners read your former and future books. Any final parting thoughts for our listeners?
No, thank you for a very thorough and engaging discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'll say only that I don't think, parents often going on about how tough it was, or grandparents, how tough it was during the Depression or during the Second World War. Yeah, externally, those were tough times, but the toughness was shared on a social level. You weren't alone with it. I think it's much harder to be a young person now than it was when I was young. I think there's more stresses, there's more isolation, there's more insecurity. So if you're feeling all that, you're not crazy.
Yeah. I agree 100% that things are more stressful with the social media and internet. I agree 100% that this was on my end very engaging to get to speak to you. So thank you, Dr. Maté.
Okay, well, thank you and take care.
Take care.